Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Are you all there?
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, now today probably is the last class that I will have with you, and we still have to finish this essay. So let's run through it. Okay. Now, so far, what we have read in this essay is how Stephen Greenblatt, he introduces the words resonance and wonder, and then he gives us an idea of what he means by new historicism. And then he also gives us Louis Montrose's explanation or definition of it. And then he talks about its applicability to art museums. And after that, he talks about the difference between literary art and the visual arts, their similarity and their the differences and their similarities. And he says that the similarity between visual arts and literary arts is their historicity. Then he talks about the museums, the way in which museums, they source their artifacts and the way they display them. And he says that all the alterations, the tamperings, which are due to two reasons, displacement and trivial accidents, all these have their own resonant power. They all resonate something, they all suggest something or imply something about what has happened with these artifacts, or what is behind them, their where they have been sourced from or how they have been handled. And this is their historicity. So after that, he talks about the resonance of contextual displays, how things, objects which are not the main object to be viewed, they are also displayed side by side to create that element of resonance, that element of historicity. And there are times when these contextual objects, they take on more significance and more, you can say, importance than the main object itself. After that, he goes on to a description of the State Jewish Museum in Prague, and he describes the different, the Judaica on display, and he talks about the paintings by those people, by those artists and those people who were in concentration camps and who later perished. And he says how all these objects, they may not have an aesthetic, essence, but they have a very strong, a very powerful resonance. And that resonance is a desolate kind of resonance there. And he says that these things that are to be seen there, they were not originally meant to be displayed as aesthetic pieces of art. Rather, they were objects which were, used also as concealment, such as the Torah curtains and the binders and pointers and things like that, that he talks about. But all these things have their unavoidable resonance. Okay. So I think we have stopped there, and I'll continue reading from there on page 47. Okay, so he says that when he talked about he says that mingled with these voices are others of those Jews in 1389 who were murdered in the old new synagogue, where they were seeking refuge of the great 16th century Kabbalist Yehuda ben Bezalel, who is known as Rabbi Lo, and who is fabled to have created the golem. So these things, they bring back to the mind, they bring back to the memory of the viewers, things which are not actually displayed there, but which are associated with them. And you can look up these things. The Kabbalah was a kind of, it was a school of Jewish thought. It was a school of Jewish mysticism, where these mystics, they sought to understand and explain the relationship between God and the mortal universe. And they created what these things, objects which were called golem, which were actually clay figures that were brought to life by the rabbi. And through this, the Jewish mystics, they tried to come closer to God, and they were also created as kind of talismans to protect the ghettos from persecution. So all these things, they have their strong resonance. And then he says that they also bring to mind the 20th century's ironic Kabbalist from Prague, Franz Kafka. Now, I suppose all of you have heard of Franz Kafka, who was a novelist, and he was, he is associated with that term called Kafkaesque, which is which denotes some kind of a senselessness, a kind of bizarreness, a kind of absurdity that Kafka found in the universe. Okay. So let's go on from there. Now, it is Kafka who would be most likely to grasp imaginatively the State Jewish Museum's ultimate source of resonance, the fact that most of the objects are located in the museum were displaced, preserved, and transformed categorically into works of art because the Nazis stored the articles they confiscated in the Prague synagogues that they chose to preserve for this very purpose. So, this very act, you can say this very process of the Nazis, where they plundered and they persecuted the Jews and they displaced all their objects of art. But those objects of art, they were again stored in the Jewish synagogues, and these synagogues were chosen to preserve all these artifacts. So this was a paradoxical kind of, act by the Nazis, where on the one hand they were plundering and destroying, and on the other hand they were also preserving them. In 1941, the Nazi Hochschule in Frankfurt had established an institute for the exploration of the Jewish question, which in turn had initiated a massive effort to confiscate Jewish libraries, archives, religious artifacts, and personal property. Now, these Nazi Hochschules, Hochschule is actually a German term for the higher institutes like colleges and universities. So in these higher institutes of Nazi Germany, in one of those institutes in Frankfurt, there had been established an institute for the exploration of the Jewish question. Now, this Jewish question was a kind of a debate that had been going on from very early ages. And the Jews, were they were blamed by the Christians for being Christ killers. The Christians, they looked upon at the Jews as being the reason for the death of Christ because of their sinful ways for which Christ had to give up his life. And that is why they regarded the Jews as a kind of a menace. They regarded the Jews as a kind of a, they said that the Jews are our misfortune. And the Jews are always regarded with suspicion because of their, very rigid religious practices, which they refuse to give up. And because it is felt that the Jews have a plan, some kind of a scheme to take over the entire globe, to, dominate the entire globe. So this Jewish question about the, you can say, the social and political status of the Jews, what rights they could they be given as minorities, all this makes up what is called the Jewish question. So this higher institute in Prague, it had a department to look into the Jewish question, and which in turn had initiated a massive effort to confiscate Jewish libraries, archives, religious artifacts, and personal property. By the middle of 1942, Heydrich, as Hitler's chief officer in the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, had chosen Prague as the site of the Central Bureau for dealing with the Jewish question, and an SS officer, Untersturmführer Karl Rahm, had assumed control of the small existing Jewish museum founded in 1912, which was named the Central Jewish Museum. Okay, so now, this Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, this was established in 1936 after Nazi Germany had established control over that part of, Europe, which is now modern-day Czechoslovakia. And there they had chosen Prague. Prague was the capital of it. and they had chosen Prague as the site for the Central Bureau for dealing with the Jewish question. And there was an SS officer. Now, this SS refers to what in German is called Schutzstaffel, which was a paramilitary organization under Hitler. Okay, so there was an officer by the name of Karl Rahm, and this term that is used here, Untersturmführer, this is actually a rank in the SS. So he was assigned this control of the small existing Jewish museum, which had been founded in 1912, and which was announced that the numerous hitherto scattered Jewish possessions of both historical and artistic value on the territory of the entire protectorate must be collected and stored. Items arrived from Jewish communities in Bohemia and Moravia. The dates of the shipments closely coordinated with the deportation of their donors to the concentration camps. So who are these donors? These donors were those Jews who were sent to the concentration camps, and all their, all their possessions, they were confiscated, and all the artifacts were transported to these museums. The experts formerly employed by the original Jewish museum were compelled to catalog the items, and the Nazis compounded this immense task by also ordering the wretched, malnourished curators to prepare a collections guide and organize private exhibitions for SS staff. Between September 1942 and October 1943, 4 major exhibitions were mounted. Since these required far more space than was available in the existing Prague synagogues, made vacant by the Nazi prohibition of Jewish public worship, were partially refurbished for the occasion. Hence, in March 1943, for example, in the 17th century Klaus synagogue, there was an exhibition of Jewish festival and life cycle observances when Sturmbannführer Gunther first toured the collection on April 6. Now, this again was an officer of the SS. He demanded various changes, including the translation of all Hebrew texts and the addition of an exhibit on kosher butchering. Now, kosher, was a kind of, you can say it was a kind of a ritual preparation of food and the eating of food according to Jewish laws. Okay, so plans were drawn up for other exhibitions, but the curators, who had given themselves with a strange blend of selfishness, irony, helplessness, and heroism to the task, were themselves at this point sent to concentration camps and murdered. Now, all this is the history of the Holocaust that he is telling us, and all this history comes to mind on viewing those objects which the viewers could see in the State Jewish Museum. Okay, so this is what he's trying to do, is he's trying to explain the meaning of the word resonance. Okay, the sense of the word resonance. After the war, the few survivors of the Czech Jewish community apparently felt they could not sustain the ritual use of the synagogues or maintain the large collections. In 1949, the Jewish Community Council offered as a gift to the Czechoslovak government both the synagogues and their contents. These became the resonant, impure memorial complex they are, a cultural machine that generates an uncontrollable oscillation between homage and desecration, longing and hopelessness, the voices of the dead and the silence. So it is in this way that these museums, they are not merely museums, but rather, he says, they are memorial complexes, and they are a kind of a culture machine that generates this, going forth oscillation between homage as well as desecration. Meaning homage is being paid to their artifacts in the museum, but at the same time, these very artifacts are memorials to the desecration, to the destruction that was leashed upon them, and the longing and the hopelessness, the longing that they had in perhaps in creating these artifacts, the longing for some kind of immortality, but the hopelessness that went with it, their awareness that their hopes not to be fulfilled, the voices of the dead and silence. For resonance, like nostalgia, is impure, a hybrid forged in the barely acknowledged gaps, the caesure between words such as state, Jewish, and museum. So he says that resonance is like nostalgia and it is impure. Why? Because it is a hybrid, and it is a hybrid between between something that is and desecration. It is sad, the tragedy as well as the preservation of that thing. So it is, he compares it to a caesure which is actually, it is an element that comes in prosody. When you are studying prosody and there is a missing, you can say, foot in the metrical unit, that is called a caesure. So that missing element, it is a hybrid made up from those missing elements between words such as state, Jewish, and museum, meaning that there are things missing between these words which are not acknowledged, which are not talked of, and yet these museums are houses to those very missing items. That is their resonance, or that is their quality of resonance. I want to avoid the implication that resonance must be necessarily linked to destruction and absence. It can be found as well in unexpected survival. The key is the intimation of a larger community of voices and skills and imagined ethnographic thickness. Now he takes a new turn and he says that it is not necessary that resonance be like the resonance that he has been talking about till now about the Jewish, the Jewish tragedy, let's say. So he says that resonance is not necessarily linked to destruction and absence. It can also be found in survival. And for that example, he says, he talks about a larger community of voices and skills in an imagined ethnographic thickness. Now, this ethnographic thickness actually is a kind of a qualitative research technique in which detailed description and interpretation of situations is taken up about any ethnographic group. So he says that here another example will serve. In the Yucatan, there is an extensively large, unexcavated late classic Mayan site called Coba, the principal surviving feature of which is a high pyramid known as Nahochmul. Okay, so he takes as a second example something from the Yucatan. Now, this Yucatan is an area in Central America, the area between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, and it was a center of Mayan civilization. So he says that in the Yucatan, there is a late unexcavated classical Mayan site. Now, these Mayas were a community who belonged to a group of language called the Maya group of language, the Mexicans and all the other countries around it. So there is a place called Coba, the principal surviving feature of which is a high pyramid known as Nahochmul. After a day of tramping around the site, I was relaxing in the pool of the nearby Club Med archaeological villa in the company of a genial structural engineer from Little Rock. To make conversation, I asked my poolmate what he, as a structural engineer, thought of Nahochmul. From an engineer's point of view, he replied, a pyramid is not very interesting. It's just an enormous gravity structure. Now, this Nahochmul is the second largest pyramid in the world. Now, the engineer said he looked at it from the, the technical and the scientific point of view, and he said that a pyramid is just an enormous gravity structure. But he added, did you notice that Coca-Cola stand on the way in? That's the most impressive example of contemporary Mayan architecture I've ever seen. I thought it quite possible that my leg was being pulled, but I went back the next day to check. Anxious to see the ruins, I had, of course, completely blocked out the Coke stand on my first visit. Sure enough, some enterprising Maya had built a remarkably elegant shelter with a soaring pyramidal roof constructed out of ingeniously intertwined sticks and branches. Places like Koba are thick with what Spencer called the ruins of time, a nostalgia for a lost civilization that was in a state of collapse long before Cortes or Montejo cut their violent paths through the jungle. So now he tells us that there was something there apart from the ruins of Koba, and that something was the coke stand which had been built on the basis of Mayan architecture. And he says that that was something that was remarkable, that was something that was outstanding, and it followed what is called the ruins of time, meaning it was an attempt to bring back from the ruins of time something, something beautiful, okay, or to bring back something from the ruins of time. It was a nostalgia for a lost civilization that was in a state of collapse long before. Now, this Cortes and Montejo, they are both Spanish, invaders, and Spain had colonized this Mayan area. And so all their architecture and everything had been plundered and destroyed by these Spanish invaders. So he says that this civilization, which was lost even before Cortes or Montejo cut their violent paths through the jungle. But despite frequent colonial attempts to drive them or imagine them out of existence, the Maya have not in fact vanished, and a single entrepreneur's architectural improvisation suddenly had more resonance for me than the mounds of the lost city. So he says that resonance does not have to be associated with destruction and absence. It can also be associated with survival. And the example he gives is of this Mayan, of this Coca-Cola stand, which had been constructed in the Mayan architectural pattern. And he says that this was a resonant fact, the fact that the person who had constructed that Coca-Cola stand was trying to bring back from memory a civilization that was lost. My immediate thought was that the whole Coca-Cola stand could be shipped to New York and put on display in the Museum of Modern Art. It is that kind of impulse that moves us away from resonance and toward wonder. For MoMA is one of the great contemporary places, not for the hearing of intertwining voices, not for historical memory, not for ethnographic thickness, but for intense, indeed enchanted looking. So now he is shifting, or he is moving on from resonance to the quality of wonder. So he says, looking may be called enchanted when the act of attention draws a circle around itself from which everything but the object is excluded, when intensity of regard blocks out all circumambient images, stills all murmuring voices. So wonder is something that is completely different from resonance. Resonance is when you have all those things piled upon the artifact, but wonder is when you are in a, you can say, isolated space, when you have constructed a kind of a circle around yourself into which you do not let these things permeate. Okay, to be sure, the viewer may have purchased a catalog, read an inscription on the wall, or switched on a cassette player, but in the moment of wonder, all this apparatus seems mere static, meaning to say that the moment of wonder is that moment when you look at only the object without any contextual, thought or any contextual reference. The so-called boutique lighting that has become popular in recent years, a pool of light that has the surreal effect of seeming to emerge from within the object rather than to focus upon it from without, is an attempt to provoke or heighten the experience of wonder, as if modern museum designers feared that wonder was increasingly difficult to arouse, or perhaps that it risked displacement entirely onto the windows of dress shops and antique stores. The association of that kind of lighting with commerce would seem to suggest that wonder is bound up with acquisition and possession, yet the whole experience of most art museums is about not touching, not carrying home, not owning the marvelous objects. Okay, so he says that this feeling of wonder is something that may be associated with, acquisition and possession, meaning a person is moved by the beauty of an object, and the feeling is intensified when the person feels that he or she can possess that object, he or she can acquire that object. Okay. But he says museums, they function on the essence or on the experience of not touching, not carrying home, not owning the marvelous objects. Modern museums, in effect, at once evoke the dream of possession and evacuate it, meaning that through their boutique lighting, through their display, their method of display, modern museums, what do? They increase this sense of wonder, and with the sense of wonder comes the dream of possession. But at the same time, these modern museums, they have also another technique lined up which evacuates that dream of possession, or which shatters that dream of possession. Because the moment that object is removed from that setting, from that lighting, it will appear as something that is very ordinary, something that loses its wonder. So he says that modern museums, in effect, at once evoke the dream of possession and evacuate it. Alternatively, we could say that they displace that dream into the museum gift shop, where the boutique lighting once again serves to heighten the desire for acquisition, now of reproductions that stand for the unattainable works of art. So modern museums, what do? They evoke, through their display, they evoke this dream of possession and acquisition. But after that, they displace that dream. And how do they displace that dream? By shifting the attention of the viewers from the object displayed to the store, to the shop. They have an accompanying shop in the museums where the viewers can buy reproductions of those objects, and the shop also has the same kind of lighting, so that the viewers are as moved by wonder by these things, which are actually reproductions, which are not original pieces, but which they can acquire and possess. That evacuation is a historical rather than structural aspect of the museum's regulation of wonder. That is, collections of objects calculated to arouse wonder arose precisely in the spirit of personal acquisition, and were only subsequently displaced from it. So he says that this element, or this technique of evacuation, is something that has developed from history. It is historical, and it is not just a structural aspect of the museum. And he says that in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we characteristically hear about wonders in the context of those who possessed them or who gave them away. Hence, for example, in his life of Saint Louis, Joinville writes that during the king's stay in Saida, someone brought him a stone that split into flakes. Now, he's going to give an example of how during the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, what was wonder, and how, these objects which were, you can say, which were the subject of wonder. How museums came to house these objects which would arouse wonder in the viewers. So he gives the example of the life of Saint of Joinville, who writes about a stone that someone had given to the king. Now, this Joinville was a 13th century chronicler of France, and he wrote this biography of Louis X of France. And he says that Saida was a city, a place in Lebanon, which was famous for glass making. And he says that someone got this stone from Saida and gave it to the king. And he describes that stone. It was the most marvelous stone in the world, for when you lifted one of the flakes, you found the form of a sea fish between the two pieces of stone. This fish was entirely of stone, but there was nothing lacking in its shape, eyes, bones, or color to make it seem otherwise than if it had been alive. The king gave me one of those stones. I found a tench inside. It was brown in color and every detail exactly as you would expect a tench to be. A tench is a kind of a fish. So what he is describing here is the beauty of that stone in itself. It does not have anything connected to it. It is just an object of wonder, something that can be looked at and something that can be, marveled at. The wonder cabinets of the Renaissance were at least as much about possession as display. The wonder derived not only from what could be seen, but from the sense that the shelves and cases were filled with unseen wonders, all the prestigious property of the collector. So now he says that the sense of wonder stemmed not only from the beauty of the object, but also from the thought that that object was in possession. In the possession of the person. In this sense, the cult of wonder originated in close conjunction with a certain type of resonance, a resonance bound up with the evocation not of an absent culture, but of the great man's superfluity of rare and precious things. So he says that in this sense, wonder can also be said to have a resonance, but this resonance is not of the past, but this resonance is about the prosperity of the person who possesses that wonderful object. Those things were not necessarily admitted for their beauty. The marvelous was bound up with the excessive, the surprising, the literally outlandish, the prodigious. So these were the things that gave that object wonder. The fact that it was excessively expensive, the fact that it was something that was outlandish, the fact that it was prodigious or abnormal. They were not necessarily the manifestations of the artistic skill of human makers. Technical virtuosity could indeed arouse admiration, but so could Nautilus shells, ostrich eggs, uncannily large or small bones, stuffed crocodiles, and fossils. And most important, they were not necessarily objects set out for careful viewing. So he says that at that time, wonder was not, wonder was not associated only with those objects which were artistic. Wonder was not an aspect of anything that was, a result of technical virtuosity or artistic skill, but wonder is something that, he says that wonder could also be given to things which are products of natural processes, such as Nautilus shells. Now, these Nautilus shells are very beautiful shells which are divided into compartments and which have, which is coiled like a snail upwards, and which the inside of it is beautiful mother of pearl. And so, the Nautilus shells are also said to be arranged in a golden mean. They are symbolic. They have a sacred connotation because they are supposed to be symbolic of evolution. So he says that Nautilus shells, which have a symbolism, a holy or sacred symbolism to them, or even ostrich eggs, which are very big, or uncannily large or small bones, stuffed crocodiles, fossils, all these things could also be objects of wonder. What he means to say is that wonderful objects were not only objects which were aesthetically created, not objects which were created by the skill of the artisan, but it could be anything that was different. Okay. The experience of wonder was not initially regarded as essentially or even primarily visual. Reports of marvels had a force equal to the seeing of them. Seeing was important and desirable, of course, but precisely in order to make possible reports, which then circulated as virtual equivalents of the marvels themselves. After that, he goes on to say that wonder could be aroused not only by the sight of those objects, but also by the by the hearing of those objects, by hearing about those objects, that is through visual, through reports. Okay. So he says reports of marvels had a force equal to the seeing of them. The great medieval collections of marvels are almost entirely textual. And he gives examples of these textual marvels: Friar Jordanus's Marvels of the East, Marco Polo's Book of Marvels, Mandeville's Travels. All these are, travel logs which tell of exotic lands and exotic things, and they arouse as much wonder in the mind of the reader as viewing any wonderful or beautiful object could have been. Some of the manuscripts, to be sure, were illuminated, but these illuminations were almost always ancillary to the textual record of wonders, just as emblem books were originally textual and only subsequently illustrated. Meaning to say that to arouse wonder, one did not only need to see those things, one could also hear of things and be as much moved by wonder. Even in the 16th century, when the power of direct visual experience was increasingly valued, the marvelous was principally theorized as a textual phenomenon, as it had been in an antiquity. No one can be called a poet, wrote the influential Italian critic Minturno in 1550s, who does not excel in the power of arousing wonder. So he's saying that wonder was also a textual phenomenon. It was not entirely visual. For Aristotle, wonder was associated with pleasure as the end of poetry. And in the Poetics, he examines the strategies by which tragedians and epic poets employ the marvelous to arouse wonder. For the Platonists, too, wonder was conceived as an essential element in literary art. In the 16th century, the Neoplatonist Francesco Patrizzi defined the poet as principal maker of the marvelous, and the marvelous is found, as he put it, when men are astounded, ravished in ecstasy. Patrizzi goes so far as to posit marveling as a special faculty of the mind, a faculty that in effect mediates between the capacity to think and the capacity to feel. So what he is saying is that wonder is not something that is embodied in the object only. It is something that can be found through a text also, something that can be conveyed through words also. By the later Renaissance, these humanistic ideas had begun to influence visual display, so that the ruler's magnificence was increasingly associated with not only possessing but showing wonders. Hence, in Prague in the late 16th century, Rudolf II ordered significant reconstruction of the imperial palace in order to provide a suitable setting for his remarkable collections. Okay, so by the late Renaissance, these humanistic ideas about wonder, about how objects and texts could arouse wonder, could send a person into a state of astounded, ravished ecstasy, they began to affect the influence visual display, and so that the rulers who had the possession of all these wonderful things, they started to display their possessions. Hence, he talks about how Rudolf II ordered a reconstruction of the imperial palace in order to provide a suitable setting for his remarkable collections. The emperor's possession of a Kunstkammer. Now, these Kunstkammers were cabinets. They are, this is German for cabinets of wonder, or, wonder rooms, which contain all these wonderful objects. So Rudolf II, he had his palace restructured, remodeled, so that he could display all these, his possessions. The emperor's possession of a Kunstkammer, the world in microcosm, writes Thomas Kaufmann, expressed his symbolic mastery of the world. That mastery could be displayed and reinforced in the wonder experienced by those allowed to enter the specially designed rooms. But as admission was limited to visiting dignitaries and ambassadors, the large-scale cultural power of the marvelous remained, even in this instance, heavily invested in textual transmission. So, though he had these rooms set up, yet everybody was not allowed into those rooms. Okay, so because everybody was not allowed into these, display rooms, uh, the sense of wonder was aroused in the public, even through the textual transmission of it, even through the, descriptive, the textual description of it.
Ma'am, this could also be related to like the palaces we visit in Jaipur. There, the kings and the queens, they exclusively, they specially design these structures for viewers, and they take revenue. But we can like relate these.
Now, the taking of revenue is a more, contemporary thing. It was not the kings who used to take revenue for it. Now, you can say that those palaces have also been converted into kinds of museums, where all these things are displayed. And the objective of displaying those objects is both wonder as well as resonance. You even marvel at the beauty of those things, and at the same time, they also bring back to mind, all these sound and light shows that you have, where there is a kind of an attempt to bring back the past through audio and visual aids. Okay, so he says that it was the diplomat's report on the wonder of things seen that would enhance the emperor's prestige. So after the, at the later stages of the Renaissance, this idea came about, that a display of these possessions of emperors could also increase their prestige. It could be a kind of a symbolic mastery or control that they had established over the world. Modern art museums reflect a profound transformation of the experience. The collector, a Getty or a Mellon, may still be celebrated, and market value is even more intensely registered, but the heart of the mystery lies with the uniqueness, authenticity, and visual power of the masterpiece, ideally displayed in such a way as to heighten its charisma, to compel and reward the intensity of the viewer's gaze, to manifest artistic genius. So now he says that the modern art museums, there is a kind of a transformation of this experience of wonder and resonance. And he says that the collector, whether these two names that are given here are, very rich American art collectors. Now, even these American or modern art collectors may still be celebrated, meaning a display of their possessions can still arouse wonder. And that sense of wonder would also include the fact or the awareness of the market value of those objects. But the heart of the mystery lies with the uniqueness, authenticity, and visual power of the masterpiece, ideally displayed in such a way as to heighten its charisma, to compel and reward the intensity of the viewer's gaze, and to manifest artistic genius. Museums display works of art in such a way as to imply that no one, not even the nominal owner or donor, can penetrate the zone of light and actually possess the wonderful object. So this is the transformation in exhibition by museums that has come about, that things are now displayed in such a way that their charisma is heightened, and the implication, they are displayed in such a way that it is implied that not even the owner of those objects can penetrate through the zone of light and possess those wonderful objects. Hence, the modern museum paradoxically intensifies both access and exclusion. The treasured object exists not principally to be owned, but to be viewed. Even the fantasy of possession is no longer central to the museum gaze, or rather it has been inverted so that the object in its essence seems not to be a possession, but rather to be itself the possessor of what is most valuable and enduring. Meaning to say that now the focus has been, shifted from, the gaze of the museum goer, from the way in which he views, rather to the object itself. And it is now, he says that the object in essence seems not to be a possession. It is the fact that the object is possessed by somebody is not a source of its wonder. Rather, the object in itself seen as possessing something. So it is now not the possessor or the collector who is considered to be important, considered to be prosperous or whatever, but it is the object itself which is considered to be most valuable and enduring, and the object itself is considered to be a possessor of something. And what is that thing? What the work possesses is the power to arouse wonder, and that power in the dominant aesthetic ideology of the West has been infused into it by the creative genius of the artist. So now the focus has shifted from the medieval ages, from the possessor to the object itself. Okay. It is beyond the scope of this brief paper to account for the transformation of the experience of wonder from the spectacle of proprietorship to the mystique of the object, an exceedingly complex, overdetermined history centering on institutional and economic shifts. But I think it is important to say that this transformation was shaped, at least in part, by the collective project of Western artists and reflects their vision. So he says that this shift in the viewing of, objects, not because of, and the wonder not being given to the possessor, but rather to the object itself, from the spectacle of proprietorship to the mystique of the object. The mystique of the object is the charm or the charisma or the glamour of the object itself. All this is a result of, he says, a collective project of Western artists who have worked hard for, this kind of new ideology to come about. And that is what we see in modern museums. Already in the early 16th century, when the marvelous was still principally associated with the prodigious, Durer begins in a famous journal entry describing Mexican objects sent to Charles V by Cortes to reconceive it. Now, Durer was a German painter of the 16th century. So let's see how he describes this Mexican object. He says, "I saw the things which have been brought to the king from the new golden land, a sun all of gold, a whole fathom broad, and a moon all of silver of the same size. Also 2 rooms full of the armor of the people there, and all manner of wondrous weapons of theirs, harness and darts, wonderful shields, strange clothing, bedspreads, and all kinds of wonderful objects of various uses, much more beautiful to behold than prodigies. These things were all so precious that they have been valued at 100,000 gold florins. All the days of my life, I have seen nothing that has gladdened my heart so much as these things, for I saw amongst them wonderful works of art, and I marveled at the subtle ingenia of men in foreign lands." Okay, so in this description, what is important is the fact that, the marvel or the wonder is subjected at the object itself, not at the possessor of the object, okay? Not at the cost of the object, not the value of the object in terms of material, but in the value of the object in its aesthetic sense. Durer's description is full of the conventional marks of his period's sense of wonder. He finds it important that the artifacts have been brought as a kind of tribute to the king, that large quantities of precious metals have been used, and that their market value has been reckoned. He notes the strangeness of them, even as he uncritically assimilates that strangeness to his own culture's repertory of objects, which includes harnesses and bedspreads. But he also notes in perceptions highly unusual for his own time that these objects are much more beautiful to behold than prodigies. Okay, so we see how this shift has come about, how in Durer's description itself, he has given importance to the fact that they have been brought as a tribute to the king, and that large quantities of precious metals have been used and their market value. And he also compares them. He also tries to regard them in comparison to his own culture's stock of such kind of objects, But the most important thing that he notes is the fact that they are much more beautiful to behold than prodigies. Durer thus relocates the marvelous artifacts from the sphere of the outlandish to the sphere of the beautiful, and crucially, he understands their beauty as a testimony to the creative genius of their makers. I saw amongst them wonderful works of art, and I marveled at the subtle ingenia of men in foreign lands. So now the focus has shifted to the creative genius of the makers. It would be misleading to strip away the relations of power and wealth that are encoded in the artist's response, but it would be still more misleading, I think, to interpret that response as an unmediated expression of those relations. So he says that the fact remains that the artist's response to the power structures of his time and to wealth, all those things have also gone into the creation of that object, but it would still be more misleading to think that the artist's response was an unmediated one, meaning to say that the artist was able to, focus more on the aesthetic, on his aesthetic work than on the pressures which were upon him, the social and historical or cultural pressures which were upon him. For Durer stands at an early stage of the West's evolution of a categorical aesthetic understanding, a form of wondering and admiring and knowing that is at least partly independent of the structures of politics and the marketplace. So Durer was, he was writing, he was living at the time of the Renaissance. And what Greenblatt here means to say is that this period marks a shift away from the structures of politics and the economy to an aesthetic understanding of, aesthetic understanding. Okay, this understanding by no means autonomous and yet not reducible to the institutional and economic forces by which it is shaped, is centered on a certain kind of looking, the origins of which lie in the cult of the marvelous, and hence in the artwork's capacity to generate in the spectator surprise, delight, admiration, and intimations of genius. Okay, so he says that this understanding is based on the artwork's capacity, on the capacity of that object by itself to generate surprise and delight and admiration and the intimations of genius, to draw attention to the skill of the creator or the artist. The knowledge that derives from this kind of looking may not be very useful in the attempt to understand another culture, but it is vitally important in the attempt to understand our own. For it is one of the distinctive achievements of our culture to have fashioned this type of gaze, and one of the most intense pleasures that it has to offer. So the development of this new manner of looking at art objects is a kind of a commentary on our own, you can say, on our own culture of our own contemporary ideology or principles or beliefs. He says that the pleasure does not have an inherent and necessary politics, either radical or imperialist, but Durer's remarks suggest that it derives at least in part from respect and admiration for the ingenia of others. So we have become, in a way, you can say we have become more aesthetically inclined. We have become less, in some ways, less imperialist, less political in our attitude. This respect is a response worth cherishing and enhancing. Hence, for all of my academic affiliations and interests, I am skeptical about the recent attempt to turn our museums from temples of wonder into temples of resonance. So he says that this new kind of gaze, which does not give importance to mercenary details, which does not give importance to the materialistic details behind the creation of that object of art. This is something which is worth cherishing and enhancing. And for this very reason, he says that I would not support the turning of our museums from temples of wonder into temples of resonance. Perhaps the most startling instance of this attempt is the transfer of the paintings in the Jeu de Paume and the Louvre to the new Musée d'Orsay. The Musée d'Orsay is at once a spectacular manifestation of French cultural dependence and a highly self-conscious, exceptionally stylish generator of resonance, including the literal resonance of voices in an enormous vaulted railway station. Now he's going to give us an example of this attempt to, to shift the focus from resonance to wonder. And he says that the most startling example of this is the transfer of the paintings in the Jeu de Paume. Now, Jeu de Paume actually means a tennis court in French, but this is also the name of a museum, the Galerie Nationale du Jeu de Paume, which is in Paris, and the Louvre. I suppose all of you have heard of the Louvre. So the transfer of paintings from these places to the new Musée d'Orsay. So a new museum has been, built, not built actually, it has been created, and objects of and paintings have been transferred from these other two museums to this new museum, which is the Musée d'Orsay. Now, this Musée d'Orsay in itself is an extraordinary creation because this museum has been built out of what was initially a railway station. Okay, so he says that the Musée d'Orsay is at once a spectacular manifestation of French cultural dépense. Dépense means expenditure. Okay, so it is, and a lot of expenditure has gone into that transformation of the railway station into a museum. And he says a highly self-conscious, exceptionally stylish generator of resonance. So it also resonates. There is resonance in it. And he says that resonance is a cultural resonance as well as the literal resonance of voices in an enormous vaulted railway station. So that museum is a, vaulted, it has a circular roof, and voices, they echo in that museum, which was originally a railway station. So he says there is a literal resonance of voices in that enormous vaulted railway station. By moving the Impressionist and post-Impressionist masterpieces into proximity with the work of far less well-known painters, Jean Béraud, Guillaume Duboff, Paul Serusier, and so forth, Impressionism and post-Impressionism, these are all, you can say these were all movements in art and painting, which you can look up. Impressionism was a kind of painting which paid attention to, the lighting and the movement, the element of movement that the human eye can see. Those things were, the artist tried to incorporate those aspects into the painting, and the use of paint and the stroke of the brushes was different, whereas post-Impressionism focused more on the abstract and the symbolic. So what he's saying is that in this Musée d'Orsay, all these paintings which are of different, which belong to different, you can say, backgrounds, or belong to different movements, which belong to different styles, they are all brought in together and into proximity as well with the period's sculpture and decorative arts. And there are contemporary and modern pieces also there, housed in that museum. So in this way, the museum remakes a remarkable group of highly individuated geniuses into engaged participants in a vital, immensely productive period in French cultural history. What he means to say is that by bringing all these myriad, all these varied pieces of art from various styles, various schools, various movements, the museum has been able to create a new kind of an atmosphere a new kind of an impression, and that new kind of an impression is the importance, the significance that is attached to the individual genius of all these painters, whether they belong to the Impressionist school or the Post-Impressionist, or whether they were contemporary. Okay. The reimagining is guided by many handsomely designed informational boards, cue cards in effect, along, of course, with the extraordinary building itself. And he says that this reimagining of this entire aesthetics, of art is guided by these various things like cue cards, and the extraordinary building itself is a kind of a testimony to this importance, to this significance that is attached to something that is aesthetic, that has to the aesthetic principle, to something that is beautiful by itself, something that is extraordinary by itself without any reference to anything else. All of this is intelligently conceived and dazzlingly executed. On a cold winter day in Paris, I looked down from one of the high balconies by the old railway clocks and was struck by the evocative power of the swirling pattern formed by the black and gray raincoats of the spectators milling below, passing through the openings in the massive black stone partitions of Gay Olenti's interior. Now, Gay Olenti is the name of the Italian architect who helped to, transform that place into a museum. And he says that when I was looking from one of the high balconies, he was struck by the beauty, the evocative power, the suggestions that came to him by this scene of black and gray raincoats of the spectators milling down there below, passing through the openings in the massive black stone partitions of Gay Olenti's interior. The pattern seemed spontaneously to animate the period's style, if not Manet, then at least Caillebotte. Now, it was as if a painted scene had recovered the power to move and to echo. And he says that the same aesthetic beauty he saw in the crowds that were, walking about with black raincoats and umbrellas. And he was reminded of these paintings, these impressionists. Manet was an impressionist. Claude Manet was an impressionist painter, and Caillebotte was also an impressionist painter. And he says that this entire scene had that same kind of beauty, that same kind of signification that was found in any beautiful piece of painting. He says it was as if a painted scene had recovered the power to move and to echo. And most important, he says that this scene that he saw had the power, as much power as any object of art, to move and to echo. Now, to move and to echo, he comes back to the two terms that he used at the beginning. To move is the element of wonder, and to echo is the element of resonance. Okay, so he says that this scene had both the element of echo, of wonder, as well as the element of resonance. But what has been sacrificed at the altar of cultural resonance is visual wonder centered on the aesthetic masterpiece. Attention is dispersed among a wide range of lesser objects that collectively articulate the impressive creative achievement of French culture in the late 19th century, but the experience of the old jeu de paume, intense looking at Manet, Monet, Cézanne, and so forth, has been radically reduced. Now he says that the cultural, you can say the skill of museums, or the technique of museums, or the system of museums to create cultural resonance has sacrificed visual wonder. And he says that attention is dispersed among a wide range of lesser objects that collectively articulate the impressive creative achievement of French culture. And he says that intense looking has been radically reduced. The paintings are there, but they are mediated by the resonant contextualism of the building itself, its myriad objects, and its descriptive and analytical plaques. So here also he finds some kind of something is lacking, and that thing lacking, he says, is the fact that there is more cultural resonance here than the arousing of wonder, because the objects have not been displayed in such a way that they could be viewed in isolation from any other kind of reference. So he says that, moreover, many of the greatest paintings have been demoted, as it were, to small spaces where it is difficult to view them adequately, as if the design of the museum were trying to assure the triumph of resonance over wonder. So this is the fault that he finds with the display system at the Musée d'Orsay. He says it is as if the museum was trying to reassure the triumph of resonance over wonder. Okay. But is a triumph of one over the other necessary? So now he comes to the conclusion, after all this elaboration upon the element of resonance and the element of wonder. Now he comes to this, final observance, and he says that, is a triumph of one over the other necessary? For the purposes of this paper, I have obviously exaggerated the extent to which these are alternative models for museums. In fact, almost every exhibition worth viewing has elements of both. I think that the impact of most exhibitions is likely to be enhanced if there is a strong initial appeal to wonder, a wonder that then leads to the desire for resonance. Now, this is exactly that what you were talking about, Priya, that these palaces which have been converted into, which have been opened to viewers. What is the aim? Yes, to these visitors, what is the aim? The aim is, there is a strong initial appeal to wonder, and this wonder then leads to the desire for resonance. Or it is generally easier in our culture to pass from wonder to resonance than from resonance to wonder. So he says that the present, mentality or the mental state or the attitude or approach of people is such that they cannot take resonance by itself without wonder. So they can pass only, they have to be captured by the charm of the object, and only after that can they shift their thought process to the element of resonance, to what lies behind it. In either case, the goal, difficult but not utopian, should be to press beyond the limits of the models, cross boundaries, create strong hybrids. For both the poetics and the politics of representation are most completely fulfilled in the experience of wonderful resonance and resonant wonder. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of this essay. And the main, you can say the main, the essence of this essay, it was to, in a, in a descriptive way, in a subjective way, and to give a kind of a practical demonstration to the attitude of new historicism, where history and literature have to be read together as co-texts, not as context. History is not the background and literature is not the foreground. They are parallel to each other. There is no kind of favoring literature over history, but to be able to understand literature, one has to read the history alongside it, or one has to read that literary piece, immersed in the history of that period. And also, in order to understand the history, one has to, take the word of that period, and the word of the period is embodied in the literature of the period. So this is what, according to Greenblatt, is the new theory of new historicism. Okay. Okay. So with that, we have managed to complete 2 topics. Now, do you have any question?
Ma'am, these dates are important, like the dates and the years which had been written. We need to learn with these dates, or we just need to go through it. Like the entire this essay consists of more than 10 to 12 dates and years. So do we need to be particular about these dates and
Yes,
years?
you should remember the dates of these. If you're talking about, like, for example, the age of enlightenment or the publication of Kant's work on enlightenment, which is considered to be the, the date on which the enlightenment movement began. In that context, the date would be important. But if there are other dates given of,
Ma'am,
things
these
which are not very
are not.
important to the main discussion, then if I am to set questions, then I would not give much importance to those dates which are not relevant to the main, to the main discussion.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
But then if your paper is going to be objective, and if supposing I have to frame, let's say if I have to make 50 questions, then I may also ask about dates. Not all of them, not many of them, but a few. Anything else? Anybody else? Anybody has any more questions? Now, are you having your classes on post-colonialism also, apart from these classes?
Ma'am, not
Or
right now. Maybe tomorrow or maybe by next week, but not right now.
are the others, have they just put on their, they've just joined and then they left, gone off to sleep or doing some other work? Because nobody seems to have any question. There's no response from anywhere else.
No, ma'am. I was listening, but I have not clearly understand this text resonance and wonder. So that's why I could not put any questions.
Not understand it. Why did you not understand it? Now, give me one difficulty that you have faced in understanding.
As far as I understood this text, I can relate this somehow to the theory of Jacques Derrida of arbitrary relationship of signifier and signifieds, where resonance is an ambience, or we can say an echo created by the creator in the museum. And the wonder is that when we see those creations in the museum, and after that seeing that creation, we think or we feel, that is a wonder. Is it right, ma'am?
Yes, this is right. But how do you connect it with Derrida? Because Derrida said that there are no fixities. There is nothing. There is no fixed meaning. Everything is loose. Everything is open. Isn't it?
That's why Derrida says the relationship of signifier and signified is arbitrary. So here we can say, after seeing the creations, after seeing the objects placed in the museum, we can feel different type. Every person can feel different types of feeling. So that's why I relate
That
this
would be the
somehow.
element of wonder. That would be the element of wonder.
Yes, ma'am. That would be the elements of wonder. Every person can have different types of feeling and thinking about the object placed in the museum.
Yes, it would depend on which aspect of that, which part of it they are focusing on, which part has attracted them more. Like if you're looking at a painting of nature, it could be the painting of the trees that looked more beautiful to someone. It could be the hills that looked more appealing to someone else. So that is wonder. But resonance would not be exactly following Derrida's conception, because resonance would point to the, in a way, the history behind it, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I did not relate resonance to the Derrida's theory. I just relate only wonder to Derrida's theory. So, was it right, ma'am?
Yes,
As far as
yes,
I understood that.
yes, you were right, because wonder is something that is individual, okay, to the viewer.
Yes.
The sense of wonder that a person feels, the level of wonder, the reason for that wonder is individual, based upon the individual interpretation by that viewer. And the emotion of wonder can be the same, but the source of that wonder would be different. It would be for different reasons, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Looking
Yes,
at
ma'am.
the same object, you would feel it is wonderful for some other reason, and your friend would feel that it is wonderful for another reason.
Yes, ma'am. That's why I thought wonder is an arbitrary. You can think according to your mindset. So, thank you, ma'am.
So that was quite an enriching discussion. Anybody else
Thank you, ma'am.
would like to point out anything?
I would like to suggest one more thing that do please make some suggestions from which type of questions can be asked from this text.
See, if it is subjective, if it is descriptive, you could be asked, first of all, what is meant by wonder, what is meant by resonance, what is meant by new historicism, what is the meaning of Montrose's statement on new the historicity of the text and the textuality of history. Then you could be asked about the examples that have been given by the writer. What are the examples of resonance and what are the examples of wonder that he has given to us? Those kind of questions.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. I have a question. Ma'am, will these questions be short answer type questions or long answer type?
That is a difficult question to answer because I don't know about the pattern of the question paper. Okay. The pattern of the question paper will depend upon it'll be depending upon many factors, such as whether you can have your exam offline or online, things like that. So
yes, ma'am.
I don't know exactly whether they're going to be long answer types or short answer type or what, but I mean, you could study it. If you study it in a descriptive way, in a subjective way, you would be covering all other types of questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
I think the session will going to end in some seconds, ma'am. So thank you very much, ma'am, for these lovely sessions.
Okay,
And thank you
thank you.
very
I
much.
also enjoyed myself, reading through these texts, and whatever little interaction I could have with you, it was nice. It was pleasant.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a whole new take on art. It's a whole new perspective to art and culture altogether.